Welcome everybody. I'm doing this lunch and learn because we have tried to implement React testing library in PCC, and Jaume asked me like, can you do a lunch and learn so everyone can see what are we, what are you doing there? Um, so I'm Pau. I'm part of the PCC project. I just put it there full stack because now I'm like the person that can do like I can touch everything. And yeah, let's go just right into it. I'm gonna do some assumptions here, all right, for the people that is in the call. That you know at least the basics of script, like promises, async await code, and everything, because most of the advantages of React testing library against time uh, are regarding this. And yeah, by the way, I'm going to talk about React testing library, but mostly comparing it to Enzyme, which is the current framework, right? I will talk about it in the next slides. Also, I will assume that you know React, or at least a little bit, and that you have worked with or you know React hooks, which is another one of the advantages of React testing library, right? If not, oops, sorry. If not, later I can give you some resources. This is being recorded, so feel free to anyways stay here, and we'll share some resources about these topics, so you can go ahead and come back later and check that. So how is React testing done? Well, how was it done before React testing libraries was born like a couple years ago? The main stack for React was using Jest and Enzyme. Jest is the testing framework, the test runner, right? The one that runs. It doesn't have anything to do with React. It's just a JavaScript testing library. And to test components, to test React components, and to test their behavior and how they look and everything, there is Enzyme. Well, there was Enzyme, right? It's a JS testing utility. What it does is it renders the React and it lets you interact with them. And it was the only option for the start, right? When React came up and people wanted to do tests and everything, the only option was to use Enzyme in that case. I'll give you now a couple of examples on how Enzyme is used with just, oops, how can I, there you go. All right. I've prepared a little, some examples, right, with, well, by the way, can you see my WebStorm instance now instead of the presentation? All right. So I prepared some examples on some simple with enzyme tests or React testing library tests, compare them. For now, I just want to show you how enzyme is being used normally, right? In a basic example, which is I have a component which is this simple component. What it does is just renders a text. All right, it just says, "Hey, this simple component, so sweet." In fact, yeah, let me do this. All right, because this is what you see in the test, right? This simple component is this one. It just has a title and it some text there which says this is a simple component, so sweet, right? What you would do in Enzyme to test, for example, that this text is shown, which is a very simple thing, is say, hey, I want a shallow, which is one of the options of Enzyme. I want a shallow component. What it does is it renders this component and it doesn't render its children. From this wrapper that you get from shallowing this component, you will try to find, right? Give me the title, find me the title, get this text, get its text, and check that it's like this simple component, right? That if we go to the code, we can see that we have a div with the class section title, a simple component, and we have a content that says simple components. All right. This is an example of an incentive. Very simple. To the comparison, we'll go more deep in different situations and everything. All right. So here we can just with the presentation, right? So which are the problems of Enzyme, of using Enzyme? React hooks is the first and most important problem, right? React hooks was one thing that that the React people came up with. mainly to substitute the state handling and to make components simpler. What it does is use something like this. Let me check. All right. Instead of making a class and saying I have a state with whichever value, what I do is in some function, instead of doing this dot set state and pass the state only the things that you want to change and everything, which was pretty complicated. They came up with an idea of like, all right, what if to have some state of some variable or some whatever, we use this, right? Use a state. You just say, all right, I want a state which is a boolean because it's inferred from this. I could write it like this, right? But it's not necessary in this case. And I have I want the value, and I want a function to change it, which makes it simpler, right? Instead of saying, hey, this dot set state for the loading, which occupies like 3 lines or something like that, is this. You say, hey, set me this value to this, and the component itself will read, right? In this case, also one of the advantages is that you don't have to write class components. You can use just functional components state inside, right? So going back to the presentation, good, right? When Rakhus came out, Enzyme didn't really adapt to that. They didn't provide any solution. If you go to the internet and check like, hey, how can I test hooks with Enzyme? Different come up like I don't know, mock state function itself, right? To mock some kind of a state and everything. Or things like making the component update manually sometimes, and they are not even feasible, right? Another thing is async code for a pretty similar situation, because hooks do is like working with async stuff and updating one and making it render. The same happens with async code. If you have to wait for something to happen and for the component to render, Enzyme is not really prepared for that, right? You need to make the component update manually, and you need to mock the jest timers and all that stuff to make the promise finish and that things. The last problem for me, well, there are more problems, but the main problem are those things for me, is that it's pretty coupled to React component names, right? When you, in that case, when you have a component that you are testing that depends on another component, you can search for it by its name. Let's say you have a component page. This page has another component called title. You can go and say, hey, in this page component, me the title component by its name. So what happens when you change this component? When you run this component, you change its name. You could make this test fail, right? Because it's searching for a component called title that maybe now it's called super or whatever you want to call it, right? Also, it's not React. It's not Enzyme is not oriented to user behavior, but to component implementation, right? In some cases, it could be good. In some others, not. We'll talk about this again when we go to the comparison. So, to solve those problems, what came up was React testing library, right? It came up like as a modern and easy to use alternative, which just has its drawbacks, but let's see. Kenzie Docs, which the one that created the React testing library, made it and said this is easy to use, DOM oriented, have like it doesn't test components, it tests the real DOM, which is the user what the user sees, and it tools for handling a code easily, more easily than what Enzyme does. Its main objective is to test what user sees and does, right? Not what the components are made of. This led testing practices, right? And I put this sentence here: no one need to set timeouts or manually update components. Not because it's something that you can read in documentation, but it's something that I encountered with myself and my colleagues, right? That React testing library solves. So let's see example of how a regtesting library test is. In that case, the same test, right, with the component that we had, that was a simple component, right, which is with its text, which is very simple. If we go to the regtesting library, what you would do is, hey, render this simple component and query this text, right? The user will not see a header or an H1 or a P or whatever, or a class. The user what will see is a text that says, hey, simple component, or this is a simple component, so sweet, right? So it's more user behavior driven in that case, right? It focuses on what does the user see. This is what he or she or sees, right? So let's test this. So, oops. Yeah, pretty simple, right? Any question from this point, testing library or Enzyme, or before going to the comparison?
Nope.
I would say no. All right. So, coming to the third point, regtesting library versus Enzyme. I will try to compare common things, right? Because they're the two options that you have for testing reg components. And that, let's see, yeah. I took these four areas, but there are more, of course. Again, there is a last slide. Well, I shared the slides with you in the calendar, by the way. Lucia put it in the description, so you can get the link from there, and you will see that the last slide, well, not the last, but the one before, is with full resources. All right, with the links about the how the migration was felt from one guy that did the migration from Enzyme to React, and explanations about React testing library and all its benefits or drawbacks and everything, right? But I chose these four areas, which are for me the most important. The first one is a change of paradigm, right? As we were saying, in Enzyme you test the component state and props. But in React testing library, what you test is what the user sees. You will never go to in a test in React testing library and say, hey, change the state of this component, or go ahead and execute this thing that changes the state directly, or this function, right? What you would do is, hey, I'm a user. To change the state, I would probably click a button or write something or move my mouse or whatever I do. And this is where it focused React testing library. So render that, given that, and given that the React testing only works with the DOM, the React testing library provides a render function that renders everything, that the component that you're testing and everything which is below. The difference with Enzyme in that case is that Enzyme provides a more flexible way of rendering, because you can do a render, which is the same that the React testing library, more or less. You have a shallow and you have a deep. You have I think we have, it's a mount. Oops, sorry, not a. So you have different ways, right? Like rendering only my component and mocking every other component, component and its children, but not the dependencies. But or you can render everything, right? The third step is test solidness. React testing library provides because of its focus on user behavior, it's not that big, right? When you change a name of a component, or you change anything that is related to the implementation, the test should not be affected in React testing library. The difference is that Enzyme, in that case, in that sense, it has drawbacks, because, as we said, you change the name of a component or whatever, you can break the test. In the other part, you can check components props and everything, which in some cases it could be better than checking, right? And the last thing is async handling. As we will see now in some examples, React testing library provides very easy in a very easy way to check things that occur as state updates and everything. In Enzyme, you probably need to do some component manual render or update or whatever, and set the timeout to wait things happen, and or mock timeouts with Jest, right? Yeah, before going to the examples, any question here? We have a question and answer section at the end, but just trying to make sure that everyone is following.
I want to elaborate a little bit more on the type of render. Would you consider React testing library being an integration test all the time because you are mounting the whole tree?
Yeah. One of the things that Kenzie Docs defends, which is the one that created the testing library, is that frontend was different than backend. And in the frontend, a component doesn't make sense without its children. Let's say you have a model, have a button on it. The model itself, it doesn't have sense without the button, because what the user sees with its button and whatever, and having a different, not implementation, but having different style, for example, or having different behaviors of the button can change how the model behaves. So he defends that to mimic user behavior and to test real user behavior, you need to do that. You cannot shallow components. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yep. But then how do you deal with the problem of needing information for children components? Like, do you have to mock everything or?
Yeah, in that case, also again, coming back to the same topic, given that you're trying to mimic user behavior on the whole page, what you do is you test your component in a specific context, right? So let's say you have a provider that provides with information, right? That fetches data from an API and whatever. Your component will not make without this data, right? So what you do is you create a for the render method of React testing library, and in that, what you do is you wrap all your tests with what your application does. Let's say you have a provider for data, you wrap this with this provider, and everything that happens in your component propagated like in a real scenario. If you have a button that triggers something in the provider of the application, and this changes on the provider application, your component render again and render another thing. This is what you should test, right? In that case, as you say, this it gets a little bit to integration tests, right? Because you're not only component, you're testing the component in a context, which is your application context and with its providers and everything. So let's say you want to test what we say, right? You have a button that changes a text. When you press the button, you don't check that the click on the button is propagated. You check that when you click the button, something gets changed in the page. And to do that, you need the provider. So, did that answer?
Yep, definitely. Thank you.
Right.
I think, Daniel, do you have a question? Because I think you have your hand.
Yeah. Following the topic that Jose opened, then how do you, in the application you work on, how do you structure that? Because then it's not that you have to do like a strategy of how to test everything properly. Because if not, I don't know, you will like be testing things twice and things like that. Because I am working currently now on Angular, and in Angular what we do is we do unit testing and we do all this shallow that is actually interpreted different. But what the argument for doing that is okay, if we want to test like the whole app integrated, we can for the end-to-ends. So how do you? I'm curious. Maybe you can answer it later, or maybe even in private if it's maybe out of context. But I would be really interested in knowing how you face that strategy.
Yeah. Let me search for a thing, which is simple that it's out there. Setup. Yeah, here. All right. Yeah. What they sorry, I don't for I don't even remember remember in Spanish. What they propose, what they propose is to make a custom render. Yeah, what I was saying before, which wraps everything in whatever providers you have in the application. In that case, this custom render, or as I have done it before, or as we do it in the PC project, what you do is this custom render you allow to pass here like a part of the state or a part of the whatever thing that you want to let each test modify. And then you have default values for everything, right? So let's say you have a big state which has a lot of properties and a lot of stuff, but you're doing a test that takes the state and only takes like a little part. You could pass to this render function another parameter, which is, all right, I want to modify this part of the state only because this is what I'm testing now. I don't know if that was more or less what
the question is more like, I mean, it's not that technical, but about how do you, I mean, if you don't, so if you test a bit like integration, how do you structure that testing strategy? Because then I don't think testing like, okay, I test the button and then I test a model that has these two buttons and then I test, you know.
So it works similar to normal integration. What you do is you take the button and you do the tests on that, but a more exhaustive tests on that button, right? A button doesn't have that maybe that much edge cases, but let's say an input, right? You have an input, you have edge cases. In there, you test all these edge cases in the input, but then the model or the card or whatever you have that has this input only tests the input in the context of the model, not all the very edge cases that you already covered.
Okay. So you let's say that you test it twice, but you split the testing responsibility in the two components where you have this button, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. You would go to, for example, a test that goes for the whole screen or the whole page and check that one input when you put, which is the type of phone, you put a number and you put a letter and it goes red, right? This, you would test it in the input. But still, you need it itself to do the test of the card.
So it's just that you don't do the shallowing, but you just keep the responsibilities separated depending on the context, what you said about the context, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the strategy is the same. The only thing is that it also makes sure that all the children of the component still work in this component, right?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense because also, I don't know if you have experience with Angular. Also, Angular is a bit tricky to resolve all the dependencies and all the modules, and so for testing, it's a bit annoying. I understand in React is way easier to handle all this. So it makes sense that could be that you don't need to do all those shallow. Nice,
yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much.
Of course, this has drawbacks. I mean, this means that if something is broke if something breaks in the button, most probably it gets broken in the component that is using it. But it makes sense because the component that is using a button, if the button is not working, it should not be working either. In the front end, context, right? I mean, the backend where you have a service that can be implemented in different stuff and you have an interface and everything, it could be different. But in that case, that's what they defend.
Very interesting, Pau. Thank you.
Right. So, where were we? We were not there. We were here, right? All right. Well, I don't know. I opened it because I was gonna go to the examples directly. So let's go to see some examples, right? On what's writing things in Enzyme or writing things in React testing library. Just to make things clear before starting, there are a lot of situations where testing it with Enzyme and testing with React testing library is exactly the same. At the end, you're testing the same code, right? It shouldn't be that different. But the good thing, the cool things are in the details, right? Where you don't have to, well, we'll see. Let's start, for example, with this simple component, right? What I, by the way, in the presentation, in the last slide, there's also a link to this repository, which I pushed, right? So if you want to go in and mess around with the stuff, you can also. So, yeah, let's see this simple component, right? That we have already seen. which renders a title and renders a simple text. What do we have? We have already seen the test in Enzyme and the test in reg testing library, which are practically the same, right? Because as I was saying, in this case, this is very simple. It shouldn't be that different. But let's do a thing, right? I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna take this title that we have here, which is simple component, and I'm gonna extract a component of that, right? I'm gonna say title. Select the title. Right. So React. Report it. I'm gonna copy whatever I have here. Simple component. Right. But in this case, I don't want to call it section title, right? Because it's just a title. So I'm gonna change the class. All right. So now I have a title that takes, well, let's say we'll need to props, right? That takes a text. All right. There's a test, and then there's this text. So instead of using a div here, I want to use this title, right? To this. Well, by the way, let me first run the tests, which makes more sense. Right? If I run them in Enzyme, they should pass. If I run the reg testing library test, they should also pass, right? So I come here and I say, hey, I have this title. Now I want to use this title component. Well, I should pass it in children, but whatever. Let's do this. Simple component. I don't need this. All right. I remove it. If I go to the reg testing library, and if I did everything good, they should still pass. All right? They still pass because they are checking for the text. They're saying, hey, render me this component and search for this text. What happens if I run them with Enzyme? In that case, because I depend on the class, it didn't find this, right? It said, hey, this doesn't exist. And if we debug this and we see what did Enzyme do, right? Why I'm not finding it? I'm gonna render whatever Enzyme rendered. We can see this. Method text is meant to run in one node. All right. This is what Enzyme renders, which in a React context makes sense, right? I have all this content. I have this div, which is this one, the content. And I have a component title with the text simple component. What do I need to do now in Enzyme to make this pass? I need to find the title, the component title. I think you're gonna already do that. Do this, right? Which makes it just a little bit less brittle. Let's say prop text to be simple component. Right. So if I do this, now the test passes. Right. So a simple little thing like refactoring a component, extracting it to another component, which we do a lot, made me change the tests. But what happens if I take this title and now I say, hey, now I don't want this to be test, I want this to be children, right? Because then I can pass it in the, now I can go here, instead of putting here text, which is a little weird, I can do this. Right? Can pass it as a children. What happens if I run the reg testing library tests? They still pass. What happens if I run this, which I already changed to make it pass? It fails again, right? It says, hey, this is undefined because I tried to go to a component title, take its prop text, and read it. But there is no prop text. Right now it's called children. So now I need to do this. and run it again, right? This is a little example of a thing that we probably do a lot, which is refactoring components. And if refactoring components takes you that time and you need to keep changing text, in that case, if you see, it really renders this because the shallow will render the children, and in that case, I call it children, so the children get rendered. But anyways, I had to change. I did 2 refactors, and both times it needed to change the right.
How can you debug what the RTL is rendering to the people see what it actually is rendering?
Yeah. So let's go here. Exactly. In that case, if I run a testing library test, what I will get from the output is DOM elements, right? It's literally HTML, which is really what the user sees. In that case, this is simple component, and this is a simple component. So sweet. It doesn't care if it has a component in the middle or whatever. It renders exactly what the user sees, which is like the most important paradigm in changing in testing library, which is don't test what the user sees, which is what is front end, right? By the way, I don't know if you have seen it, like a little not, but I'm a little bit biased in pro of testing library just because of my personal experience, right? I migrated from Enzyme 2 times, and I tried Enzyme before testing library didn't even exist. And whatever I do now, I do it always with testing library. Even if you create a test in, even if you create a project in React, it gets created with testing library, right? This is because Enzyme didn't really adapt to new stuff and to hooks. And you will see now when we start playing with things with asynchronous things, that it gets pretty complicated to test with Enzyme, and it gets pretty easy to test it in testing library. Any question about this example that I had here? I would take that as a no. Yeah. Let's continue. What else do we have here? Oops. Where did it go? Here. What else do we have? We have already seen this simple component. Let's jump into this load and start. What does this mean? If I refresh the page, you will see. Oops, I don't have it running. Did you see that? You get the loading first, and I have a timeout somewhere, right, in a service that in 1 second it returns thing, right? How does this component work? It has a state content and the state is loading. That by default is true because we are loading it in the start. But anyways, we're forcing it to true just in case. In case that you don't know what is a use effect, is something that is called when these dependencies change. This dependency is empty. If these dependencies are empty, it runs once, right? When the component is rendered first, and never again. In this case, what I'm doing is, all right, when I first render this component, I set the state to loading. Okay, I'm loading. Then I execute an async action, which is a mock that I have somewhere here, which just sets the timeout and resolves the promise, right? Execute this async action, and then take the content that comes from it, set the state to that content, and then remove the loading state, right? In the case of the code, what it does is it has a title like the other one, but it says, hey, if I'm loading, render loading. If I'm not loading, render the content, right? How does the Enzyme test work? Right? Let's see, should render content when finish loading, right? The first one just checks that load is shown, right? It's very simple like the other one because the first time you just come here and you need to see loading. But it should render content when finish loading. What we have here is we mocked the dependency, right? This is the way we can. I'm not gonna go deep into that, right? Because this is just mocking, which is commentable JavaScript mocking. But in essence, what this is doing is mocking this root, which is exactly the same as this one, and then mocking this method from this root, right? And then I have the mock here. So what I'm saying is, hey, when you call this, execute the single action mock, resolve it with this text, right? In that case, as Daniel was asking before, what we're doing is we're testing its content as all, but only the component part, right? Not the service. Not the service. The services are should be always mocked, right? Because you're not doing real calls and all that stuff. So what I'm doing is, hey, this action, I'm mocking it, return this text. Then I shallow it with Enzyme, and then I try to find. Yeah, sorry, it should be like this. Then I try to find the loading. The loading, which is this. Sorry. Then I try to find the loading. After the loading, I need a way to say, hey, now I want to stop seeing the loading and see the content that I have here, right? Because first I see the loading, then I don't. To be honest, I was not even able to make this test run, right? Because Enzyme doesn't support hooks. And you have practically no way. I mean, I made it work in other projects, but you have to do so much boilerplate code that I didn't even add it, right? Because that would make timeouts. To make this wrapper, you make this wrapper update. Make it force update, right? And even doing so, update the component, you never know if you made it do like the correct step, or how many steps does it have to do until it gets to the point, to the update that you want to see, right? Because it has an effect when you go up, but then it renders and could render again and whatever. This makes no sense because I mean, it's super messy. If I check it, if I compare it with the test that is in React testing library, in that case, the mock is exactly the same because it's still, as I said, it's a JavaScript dependency. So in that case, it's still using the mocks of Jest, which is exactly the same. In that case, look at this test. You render the component. You wait for this text, which is, in that case, I put it out, right? And I mocked it here, but in the before each, which is exactly the same. But I render the component. I just wait for the content to appear. And when the content is here, I also check that loading is not anymore in the document, right? Isn't it simple? I mean, this is what is that React testing library provides you, which is fine by text, which is asynchronous. In that case, you can say, hey, wait for this appear, and I don't need to do timeouts. I don't need to update the component manually. I don't need to do everything. I just need to say, hey, wait for this to appear, and whatever. And it works. It works pretty well. Right. This is also a very simple scenario, and I wasn't even able to test it with Enzyme. Probably what you need to do, and what I tried to do also, and everything, was to mock this, literally mock this function from React, and make it run whenever you want and everything, right? But look how simple is the test in React testing library. I wanted to give a couple more of examples doing that, right? But they are exactly the same. If I go to the example that I have here, I have mocked text. I had another one which does exactly the same, but clicking a button instead of the first, or instead of loading it in the first time, right? I click here, wait a second, it works. If we go to the React testing library test, trigger action, React testing library, right? What I do is exactly the same. I mock the dependency, I render the component, I get this button, right? Now I will explain what this means, but I get the button, I click it, I wait content, and I just check that this isn't the document, that this has the text that you need, and the loading is not there anymore, right? No timeouts, no manual updates, no nothing, right? Any question on this? Because now I'm the last thing that I'm going to explain a little bit are the queries on React testing library. But on async code and async stuff, any question?
How much will it, I mean, how complicated will it be if you had two separate async calls trigger at the same time? If you had to wait for two things?
It doesn't matter, really. If I had two here, if in that code, instead of executing this async action, after this I was executing another one, it doesn't matter. It handles the waiting for you. Right? You just call the other one here, and in the test you say, hey, wait for this to happen. You mock the two calls, of course. You need to mock the two calls, but to do anything else, you just say, hey, I'm waiting for this to appear. If it doesn't appear, make the test fail because probably the user will not see this appear anyways, right?
Okay, fair.
All right. Any other question here? All right. The last thing that I want just to show you is the query selectors, right? Because this can be an advantage in regarding test practices, but it can also be a little bit a drawback in that case, right? Depending on the situation. In the case of Enzyme, searching for things is searching for classes, searching for component names, and all that stuff, right? The testing library has a very narrow way of searching things, which in a part makes sense because what the user sees is text and boxes. It's what the user sees. But it also makes it difficult a little bit sometimes to search for things, right? In that case, button. All right, here I have this button, right? Which is this one, which is a loaded component. Which I had to back with this data test ID attribute, right? This data test ID is a standard in React testing library. It's like the last way that they added to find a component or to find an element. Like if you don't have any other option, like finding it by tag name or finding it by text or finding it by area level, even you can search things by using the accessibility attribute. If you don't have any other way, then you can use this, right? Which works like this, right? Like say, hey, give me this by test ID load button, which is the one that is here, right? If not, you can use another one, which is like well, in that case I did a test ID everywhere thing. But let's put it like this, right? The load and start component that we have seen before, this one, right? I'm not searching for any element. I'm searching for the text. I'm saying, hey, in the screen, the user will see a text. Wait for it. Wait for this text to appear anywhere. This text. I don't need to find like for a deep or for a whatever, right? You just say, hey, this text needs to appear in the screen, right? Right. Was just a little puntualization. So, sorry. Any question about the queries? Well, whatever. Yeah. Let's move. The questions are like in the next slide or something like that, and we can give like 10-minute questions, something like that. So then the question is, do I ever need Enzyme? So as Daniel was saying and Jose, of course, Enzyme at the end provides real unit testing, right? Which means I'm testing this component in total isolation of anything else. Right? If you need to do that, use Enzyme, no problem. It has its pros and cons. And the good thing also is that you can use both in the same project, right? Let's say you are migrating, like we are doing in the PCC, right? We had Enzyme, we're migrating to React testing library. We don't have to migrate all the tests. You can have both in the same environment. Well, today we discovered that you cannot have them in the same file, in the same table, but you can have them in the same project, right? So you don't need any rush to migrate or whatever. Conclusions. And this is also mixed with like my personal experience, which I have been talking about like all the presentation. The winner is, I'm gonna say, for me, I think it's very clear, right? For me, testing library, it's pretty good. I had a lot of pain testing in React because of Enzyme. At some point, I even said like, I'm not gonna test this because this is gonna be too hard to test it in Enzyme. And I found that this situation didn't even happen in React testing library, never, right? But again, I'm biased. I'm biased because all the presentation went about giving advantages about React testing library over Enzyme, but always because of my personal experience, right? I migrated a couple of projects. I tried to test with Enzyme. I tried to test with React testing library and everything. And what I found is that my opinion really matches with one of the examples that yeah, let me first go here with this article, right, with this of David Boyne, which explains his experience moving from Enzyme to testing library, which is pretty coupled of what I think. You can read it because it's more or less what I explained, but a little bit more detailed and everything. So much everyone for attending. Some questions. We have 10 minutes. So whatever thing that the you.
Pau, could you explain the three types of queries that you have in React testing library, please?
Yeah. It looked like a prepared question, even, right?
Maybe it is.
No, it's not. So yeah, you have three ways of searching for components. Right? You have query. You have well, you have query. You have get, and you have find. Right? Which are the difference of these three? If you do a get, right? I'm talking always about the first part before the buy, right? Because they are composed. You choose if you do a get, a query, or a find, and then you choose if you set by test ID, by text, by area level, whatever, right? In the case of the query, you use query when you try to search for an element and check if it is in the document or not, right? Why? Because it returns the element if it is there, or null if it is not there. So you can do the like the checking after that. If you use a get, you need to be sure that this component is in the page. Let's say you are loading anything. When you finish loading, you will have a content, right? So you can do a query by this content, check that this content is here, but you will know that if this content is here, this button will be here. So you use a get. You say, hey, I want to click this button. I don't need to check if this button is here or not, because I know that if this content is loaded, the button is there. If it's not there, it will throw an exception instead of checking to be in the document, and the message will not be that explanatory, right? So we use this get whenever you want to click something or to get something or to get something that you will make sure that you will be pretty sure that this component is there. That we have is a find, which we had here, right? The find works exactly the same as the get, but it's asynchronous. Instead of returning the element, it returns a promise of the element, right? That you can await. In this case, React will do what we talked, right? It will wait for everything and check if there's any promise pending or there's anything, and if it didn't find it and there's no promise pending and there's no timeout pending and anything, it will throw and it will say, hey, I didn't find this, so it will crash. Okay. And those are the three, by the way. Any other question? Well, did I answer enough, Jordi?
Yes.
That's all. So thank you everyone for coming.